Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition, and we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And today we'll be reading chapter 5, and this will be part 2. So let's get right to it. Let me I'm going to move the camera in a little bit here so you guys can follow. If you have your own book, you can follow there too. But otherwise, you can follow with us here. All right, here we go. The hidden agenda, world socialism. Although most of the policy statements of the World Bank deal with economic issues, a close monitoring of its activities reveal a preoccupation with social and political issues. This should not be surprising, considering that the bank was perceived by its founders as an instrument for social and political change. The change which it was designed to bring about was the building of world socialism. And that is exactly what it is accomplishing today. This hidden agenda becomes crystal clear in the nature of what the bank calls sectoral loans and structural adjustment loans. In the first category, only part of the money is to be used for the costs of specific projects, while the rest goes to support policy changes in the economic sector. In the second group, all of the money is for policy changes and none of it is for projects. In recent years, almost half of the loans to underdeveloped countries have been in that category. What are the policy changes that are the object of these loans? They add up to one thing, the building of world socialism. Loans going to underdeveloped countries sounds like the USAID debacle that's going on right now. Anyways, as the Fabians had planned it, the word socialism is not to be used. Instead, the loans are issued for government hydroelectric projects, government oil refineries, government lumber mills, government mining companies, and government steel plants. It is delivered from the hands of politicians and bureaucrats into the hands of other politicians and bureaucrats. When the money comes from government, goes to government, and is administered by government, the result will be the expansion of government. Here is an example. One of the policy changes often required by the World Bank as a condition of granting a loan is that the recipient country must hold down its wages. The assumption is that the government has the power and rightfully should have the power to set wages. In other words, one of the conditions of its loan is that the state must be omnipotent. Paul Roberts holds the William E. Simon Chair of Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Writing in Business Week, he says, the entire development process has been guided by the belief, oh, sorry, guys. The book is really thick. Okay. Okay. The entire development process has been guided by the belief that reliance on private enterprise and equity investments is incompatible with economic and social progress. In place of such proven avenues of success, development planning substituted loans and foreign aid so that governments of the LDCs, less developed countries, could control economic activity in keeping with plans drawn up by experts. Consequently, economic life in the LDCs was politicized from the start. By endowing governments with extensive control over their economies, the US set up conditions exactly opposite to those required for economic growth. And this quote was from How Experts Cause the Third World Debt Crisis by Paul Greg Roberts, Business Week, November 2nd, 1987. Ken Ewert explains further that the conditions imposed by the fund are seldom free market oriented. He says the fund concentrates on macro policies, such as fiscal and monetary policies or exchange rates, and pays little attention to fundamental issues like private property rights and freedom of enterprise. Implicit is the belief that with proper macro management, any economic system is viable. Even more important, it has allowed governments the world over to expropriate the wealth of their citizens more efficiently through the hidden tax of inflation, while at the same time aggrandizing their own power. There is little doubt that the IMF is an influence for worldwide socialism. And that quote was from the International Monetary Fund by Ken S. Ewart, The Freeman, April 1989, page 157, 158. An important feature of the structural adjustment loans is that the money need not be applied to any specific development project. It can be spent for anything the recipient wishes. That includes interest payments on overdue bank loans. Thus, the World Bank becomes yet one more conduit from the pockets of taxpayers to the assets of commercial banks, which have made risky loans to third world countries. Austerity measures and scapegoats. Not every measure advocated by the IMF and World Bank is socialistic. Some of them even appear to be in support of the private sector, such as the reduction of government subsidies and welfare. They may include tax increases to reduce budget deficits. These policy changes are often described in the press as austerity measures, and they are seen as hard-nosed business decisions to salvage the failing economies of underdeveloped countries. But as the wolf in sheep's clothing said to Little Red Riding Hood, all the better to fool you with, my dear. These austerity measures are mostly rhetoric. The borrowing nations usually ignore the conditions with impunity, and the World Bank keeps the money coming anyway. It's all part of the game. Nevertheless, the structural adjustment conditions provide a scapegoat for local politicians who can now place the blame for their nation's misery on big bad capitalists from America and the IMF. People who have been taught that it is government's role to provide for their welfare, their health care, their food and housing, their jobs and retirement. Such people will not be happy when they hear that these rights are being threatened. So they demonstrate in the streets in protest. They riot in the commercial sections of town so they can steal goods from stores, and they throng to the banner of politicians who promise to restore or increase their benefits. As described by Insight magazine, national strikes, riots, political upheavals, and social unrest in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Egypt, Haiti, Liberia, Peru, Sudan, and elsewhere have at various times been attributed to IMF austerity programs. Some came to the fund with domestic trouble already brewing and seized on the fund as a convenient scapegoat. And this quote was from IMF hands out prescription to sour economic medicine. Insight, February 9th, 1987, page 14. Quite true. An honest reading of the record shows that the IMF, far from being a force for austerity in these countries, have been an engine of socialist waste and a fountain of abundance for the corrupt leaders who rule. Facing corruption and despotism. Nowhere is this pattern more blatant than in Africa. Julius Nyerere, the dictator of Tanzania, is notorious for his villagization program, in which the army has driven the peasants from their land, burned their huts, and loaded them like cattle into trucks for relocation into government villages. The purpose is to eliminate opposition by bringing everyone into compounds where they can be watched and controlled. Meanwhile, the economy staggers, farms have gone to weed, and hunger is commonplace. Yet, Tanzania has received more aid per capita from the World Bank than any other nation. In Uganda, government security forces have engaged in mass detentions, torture, and killing of prisoners. The same is true under the terrorist government of Zimbabwe. Yet, both regimes continue to be the recipients of millions of dollars in World Bank funding. Zimbabwe, formerly Rhodesia, is a classic case. After its independence, the leftist government nationalized, confiscated, many of the farms previously owned by white settlers. The most desirable of these lands became occupied by the government's senior ruling party officials, and the rest were turned into state-run collectives. They were such miserable failures that the workers on these farmlands were themselves soon begging for food. Not daunted by these failures, the socialist politicians announced in 1991 that they were going to nationalize half of the remaining farms as well. And they barred the courts from inquiring into how much compensation would be paid to their owners. The IMF was represented in Zimbabwe at the time by Michel Kamdisus. Sorry, I butchered that name. The governor of the Central Bank of France and a former finance minister in Francois Mitterrand's socialist government. After being informed of Zimbabwe's plan to confiscate additional land and to resettle people to work on those lands, Kamdesus agreed to a loan valued at 42 million rands, with full knowledge that much of it would be used for the resettlement project. Perhaps the worst violations of human rights have occurred in Ethiopia under the Marxist regime of Mengistu Haile Mariam. The famine of 1984 to 85, which threatened the lives of millions of people, was the result of government nationalization and disruption of agriculture. Massive resettlement programs have torn hundreds of thousands of people from their privately owned land in the north and deported them to concentration camp villages in the south, complete with guard towers. A report by a French voluntary medical assistance group, Doctors Without Borders, reveals that the forced resettlement program may have killed as many people as the famine itself. And that was from Ethiopia Bar's Relief Team by Blaine Harden, Washington Post, December 3rd, 1985, page A21. Dr. Roni Brahman, director of the organization, describes their experience. Armed militiamen burst into our compounds, seized our equipment, and menaced our volunteers. Some of our employees were beaten and their trucks, medicine, and food stores confiscated. We left Ethiopia branded as enemies of the revolution. The regime spoke the truth. The atrocities committed in the name of Mengistu's master plan did make us enemies of the revolution. And that was from Famine Aid Were We Duped by Dr. Roni Brahman, Reader's Digest, October 1986, page 71. Financing famine and genocide. In 1980s, the world was saddened by photographs of starving children in Ethiopia. But what the West did not realize was that this was a planned famine. Kind of makes you wonder, isn't it? Because there was that famine in China under the Red Army, and then here in Africa, and then in Syria and many other places. Interesting, isn't it? It was modeled after Stalin's starvation program in the Ukraine in the 1930s and Mao's starvation of the peasants in the 1940s. I just mentioned that, Mao's starvation, the Red Army, in China. Its purpose was to starve the population into total submission to the government, for it is the government who decides who will eat and who will not. Yet, Right up to the time Mengistu was overthrown, the World Bank continued to send him hundreds of millions of dollars, with which of it going specifically to the Ministry of Agriculture, the very agency in charge of the resettlement program. And that quote was from James Bovard, The World Bank versus the World's Poor, Cato Policy Analysis, Washington, D.C., Cato Institute, 1987, page 4 to 6. In the late 1970s, the same story unfolded in communist Vietnam. There were resettlement programs, forced collectivization, concentration camps, atrocities, and tens of thousands of dissidents escaping to the sea only to drown in overcrowded, leaky boats. Throughout it all, the regime was generously funded by the World Bank. Laos has jailed thousands of political prisoners. Syria has massacred 20,000 members of its opposition. Indonesia has uprooted several million people from their homelands in Java. The Sandinistas in Nicaragua murdered their opposition and terrorized the nation into submission. Poland, while a puppet state of the Soviet Union, brutally suppressed its trade union movement. China massacred its dissident students and imprisoned its religious leaders, and the former Soviets slaughtered civilians in Afghanistan while conducting a relentless espionage war against the entire free world. Yet these regimes have been the recipient of literally billions of dollars from the World Bank. How can the bank's managers continue in conscience to fund such genocidal regimes? Well, one answer is they don't have a conscience. That's one answer. Another answer is control. Sorry, I digress. Part of the answer is that they're not permitted to have a conscience. Oh, okay, well, my answer is close enough. David Dunn, head of the bank's Ethiopia desk, explained, political distinctions are not something our charter allows us to take into account. And that quote was from Harnessing World Bank to the West, Insight, February 9, 1987, page 8. The greater part of the answer, however, is that all socialist regimes have the potential for genocide, and the bank is committed to socialism. The brutalities of these countries are all in a day's work for serious socialists who view them as merely unfortunate necessities for the building of their utopia. So people are just, what is that phrase called? Collateral, something collateral. I forgot that phrase. Anyways, unintended collateral. Never mind. It'll probably come to me at 3 in the morning. Lenin said, you cannot make an omelet without cracking a few eggs. We've been hearing that phrase a lot. George Bernard Shaw, one of the early leaders of the Fabian socialist movement, expressed it this way. Under socialism, you would not be allowed to be poor. You would be forcibly fed, clothed, lodged, taught, and employed, whether you liked it or not. If it were discovered that you had not character and industry enough to be worth all this trouble, you might possibly be executed in a kindly manner, but whilst you were permitted to live, you would have to live well. And that quote was from George Bernard Shaw, The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism and Capitalism, 1928, RPT. I wonder what that stands for. Maybe report? I got to find that out. Okay, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Transaction Books, 1984, page 470. Reason to abolish the Federal Reserve. The top echelon at the World Bank are brothers under the skin to the socialist dictators with whom they do daily business. Under the right circumstances, they could easily switch roles. What we have seen is merely a preview of what can be expected for the entire world if the envisioned New World Order becomes operational. The IMF World Bank is the protege of the Federal Reserve. It would not exist without the flow of American dollars and the benevolence of American leadership. The Fed has become an accomplice in the support of totalitarian regimes throughout the world. As stated in the beginning of the study, that is one of the reasons it should be abolished. It is an instrument of totalitarianism. Getting rich, fighting poverty. While the top leaders and theoreticians at the IMF and World Bank dream of world socialism, the middle managers and political rulers have more immediate goals in mind. The bureaucracy enjoys a plush life of administering the process, and the politicians on the receiving end obtain wealth and power. Ideology is not their concern. Socialism, capitalism, fascism, it makes no difference to them as long as the money flows. Graham Hancock has been an astute observer of the international aid industry and has attended their plush conferences. Yeah, Graham Hancock is an interesting author. Maybe we'll do one of his books in our book club. We'll see. We'll see what happens. He knows many of the leading players personally. In his book, Lords of Poverty, he speaks of the IMF structural adjustment loans. Corrupt ministers of finance and dictatorial presidents from Asia, Africa, and Latin America are tripping over their own expensive footwear in their unseemly haste to get adjusted. For such people, money has probably never been easier to obtain than it is today. With oops, sorry for the back and forth there. With no complicated projects to administer and no messy accounts to keep, the venal, the cruel, and the ugly are laughing literally all the way to the bank. For them, structural adjustment is like a dream come true. No sacrifices are demanded of them personally. All they have to do, amazing but true, is screw the poor, and they've already had plenty of practice at that. These people, very bad people. That quote was from Graham Hancock, Lords of Poverty, The Power, Prestige, and Corruption of the International Aid Business. That's from New York Atlantic Monthly Press, 1989, page 59 and 60. Sorry about the back and forth on the book. This is a very thick book. It's over 600 pages. And so it's kind of weird in terms of the seam here. Anyways, sorry about that. In India, the World Bank funded the construction of a dam that displaced 2 million people, flooded 360 square miles, and wiped out 81,000 acres of forest fire. In Brazil, it spent $1 billion to develop a part of the Amazon basin and to fund a series of hydroelectric projects. It resulted in the deforestation of an area half the size of Great Britain and has caused great human suffering because of resettlement. In Kenya, the Bura irrigation scheme caused such desolation that a fifth of the native population abandoned the land. The cost was $50,000 per family served. In Indonesia, the transmigration program mentioned previously has devastated tropical forests at the same time that the World Bank is funding reforestation projects. The cost of resettling one family is $7,000, which is about 10 times the Indonesian per capita income. Livestock projects in Botswana led to the destruction of grazing land and the death of thousands of migratory animals. This resulted in the inability of the natives to obtain food by hunting, forcing them into dependence on the government for survival. While Nigeria and Argentina are drowning in debt, billions from the World Bank have gone into building lavish new capital cities and to house government agencies and the ruling elite. In Zaire, Mexico, and the Philippines, political leaders became billionaires while receiving World Bank loans on behalf of their nations. In the Central African Republic, IMF and World Bank loans were used to stage a coronation for its emperor. The record of corruption and waste is endless. But the real eye-opener is in the failure of socialist ventures. Those magnificent projects which were to bring prosperity to the underdeveloped countries, Here are just a few examples. Converting money into failure. Before receiving loans from the World Bank, Tanzania was not wealthy, but it fed its own people and it had economic growth. After receiving more than $3 billion in loans, it nationalized the nation's farms and industries and converted every business into a government agency. It built a truck assembly plant, a tire factory, electronic factories, highways, ports, railways, and dams. Tanzania's industrial production and agricultural output fell by almost 1/3. Food was the main export in 1966. Under socialism, food had to be imported, paid for by foreign aid and more loans from the World Bank. The country is hopelessly in debt with no way to repay. Argentina once had one of the highest standards of living in Latin America, but then it became the recipient of massive loans from the World Bank as well as commercial banks in the United States. Since the money was given to politicians, it was used to build the only system politicians know how to build, socialism. Excuse me. By 1982, the gross national product was in a nosedive. Manufacturing had fallen to less than half of capacity. Thousands of privately owned companies had been forced into bankruptcy. Unemployment was soaring, and so was welfare. By 1989, inflation was running at an average of 5,000%, and in the summer of that year, topped at 1 million%. Wow, that's a staggering number. Banks were offering interest rates of 600% per month in hopes of keeping deposits from being moved out of the country. People were rioting in the streets for food, and the government was blaming greedy shop owners for raising prices. The nation was hopelessly in debt with no way to repay. Oh man, these poor people. They should just take away money out of the equation and just forgive the debt and just start over. Oh, geez. My goodness. Brazil is run by the military, and the state controls the economy. Government-owned companies consume 85% of all industrial investment, which means that the private sector is limited to 35% and is shrinking. The government used loans from U.S. banks to create an oil company, Petróleo Brasileiro S.A., which became Latin America's largest corporation. Despite huge oil deposits and record high oil prices, the company operated at a loss and was not even able to produce enough gasoline for its own citizens. By 1990, inflation was running at 5,000%. Since 1960, its prices had risen to 164,000 times the original level. A new crime was invented called hedging against inflation, and people were arrested for charging the free market price for their goods and for using dollars or gold as money. Led by communist organizers, mobs roamed the streets shouting, "We're hungry, steal what you will." The nation was hopelessly in debt with no way to repay. Oh gosh, these poor people. I feel sad just reading it. My goodness. The experience in Mexico was a carbon copy of that in Brazil, except that the amount of money was larger. When the world's fourth largest oil reserves were discovered, Mexican politicians reached for the brass ring. With billions borrowed from U.S. banks, they launched Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, and soon became the world's fifth largest oil producer. They also built chemical plants and railroads and launched many other industrial projects. These were run as welfare agencies instead of businesses. Too many people on the payroll, too many managers, excessive salaries, too many holidays, and unrealistic benefits. These ventures floundered and lost money. Private businesses failed by the thousands and unemployment rose. The government increased the minimum wage, causing more businesses to fail and more unemployment. That led to more welfare and unemployment benefits. To pay for that, the government borrowed even more and began creating its own fiat money. Inflation destroyed what was left of the economy. Price controls were next, along with rent and food subsidies and doubling the minimum wage. By 1982, Mexicans were trading their pesos for dollars and sending their savings out of the country as the peso became all but worthless in commerce. And that was, oh, here's a footnote. That same American banks that were making the loans were soliciting this flight capital and ended up getting deposits of the same money they had lent. It was nice business both ways. They're double dipping both sides, aren't they? Where am I? Okay. All right. Sorry, people. In 1981, the average wage for Mexican workers was 31% of the average wage for Americans. In 1989, it had fallen to 10%. Mexico, once one of the major food exporters in the world, was now required to import millions of dollars worth of food grains. This required still more money and more loans. All this occurred while oil prices were high and production was booming. A few years later, when oil prices fell, the failures and shortfalls became even more dramatic. In 1995, Mexico's bank loans were once again on the brink of default, and once again, U.S. taxpayers were thrown into the breach by Congress to cover more than $30 billion at risk. Although this loan was eventually repaid, the money to do so was extracted from the Mexican people through another round of massive inflation, which plunged their standard of living even lower. The nation is now hopelessly mired in socialism. The Communist Party, promising reform and still more socialism, is attracting a large following and could become a potent political force. Thus, the saga continues. After pouring billions of dollars into underdeveloped countries around the globe, no development has taken place. In fact, we have seen just the opposite. Most countries are worse off than before the saviors of the world got to them. Summary: the IMF and the World Bank were created at a meeting of global financiers and politicians held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. Their announced goals were to facilitate international trade and to stabilize the exchange rates of national currencies. The unannounced goals were quite different. They were the elimination of the gold exchange standard as the basis of currency valuation and the establishment of world socialism. Yeah, get some gold, people. They said gold will destroy the Fed and destroy the banks. The method by which gold was to be eliminated in international trade was to replace it with a world currency, which the IMF, acting as the world central bank, would create out of nothing. The method by which world socialism was to be established was to use the World Bank to transfer money, disguised as loans, to the governments of the underdeveloped countries, and to do so in such a way as to ensure the demise of free enterprise. The money was to be delivered from the hands of politicians and bureaucrats into the hands of other politicians and bureaucrats. When the money comes from government, goes to government, and is administered by government, the result will be the expansion of government. The theoreticians who dominated the conference at Bretton Woods were the well-known Fabian socialist from England, John Maynard Keynes, and an assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Harry Dexter White. White became the first executive director for the United States at the IMF. The Fabians are an elite group of intellectuals who agree with communists as to the goal of socialism, but disagreed over tactics. Whereas communisms advocate revolution by force and violence, Fabians advocate gradualism and the transformation of society through legislation. It was learned in later years that Harry Dexter White was a member of a communist espionage ring. What does that mean? Does that mean a sting operation? Thus, hidden from view, there was a complex drama taking place in which the two intellectual founders of the Bretton Woods Accords were a Fabian socialist and a communist, working together to bring about their mutual goal, world socialism. Capital for the IMF and the World Bank comes from the industrialized nations, with the United States putting up the most. Currencies such as the dollar, yen, mark, and franc are augmented by many times that amount in the form of credits. These are merely promises by the member governments to get the money from their taxpayers if the bank gets into trouble with its loans. The IMF gradually is evolving into a central bank for the world, with the World Bank as its lending arm. It has become the engine for transfer of wealth in underdeveloped countries. This has lowered the economic level of the donating countries, but it has not raised the level of the recipients. The money has simply disappeared down the drain of political corruption and waste. Here's a picture, looks like a stained glass window of some sort. Remold it nearer to the heart's desire. Oh, okay. So here, let's see here. Oh, down here is a paragraph. Let's read that first. This is an accurate rendering of the stained glass window in the Beatrice Webb House in Surrey, England, former headquarters of the Fabian Society. It depicts Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw striking the earth with hammers to remold it nearer to the heart's desire. Note the wolf in sheep's clothing in the Fabian crest above the globe. The window is now on display at the London School of Economics. See a color photo at www.freedom-force.org/Radier_Fabian window.cfm. Okay, so I think these two would be Sidney Webb and George Bernard Shaw, right? Striking the world. And then this is the crest, the Fabian crest. So you see there's a sheep in wolf's clothing. It's a little small, but interesting. And then down here are all the minions, I guess. Huh. Interesting. I'm going to move the camera back a little bit so you could see the whole picture. Here you go. Interesting, eh? And that is the end of chapter 5. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll continue our reading next week. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day. Okay, bye-bye now. See you next time.